welcome to Season 9, Episode 9 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop. You sound like you just woke up from a nap.
I did nap earlier, but that was like a couple hours ago, so not recently.
Was that a refreshing nap?
It was.
How long of a nap was it that it was
Tw
refreshing?
20 minutes. You have to
Yeah.
hit a right amount. If you go 30 plus, then it just makes you feel worse, I think.
I don't know. 20 is, well, I guess it depends on how you define the 20. If it's actual sleep time, I'm 100% with you. But I always take a couple minutes to fall asleep, and then you kind of have a couple minutes to wake up. So it's really a 30-minute segment. But my sweet spot, I think, is 40, including falling asleep time.
Yeah, that's a little bit longer. That makes sense. But we are, of course, still reading Orestes Brownson's The American Republic, Its Constitution, Tendencies, and Destiny. This time talking about Chapter 9, specifically talking now about the United States. So he's kind of gone over all of his theories. Now he's looking at applying these to, the American Republic, the title of the book. So it's taken us a few chapters to get here, but I think it was all good, theoretical, basis for everything he's talking about.
Yes. Now I was surprised it really just seemed, I mean, unless I'm missing a lot, seemed like this chapter was really just about one issue.
Hmm.
What was the United States, a collection of separate sovereign states, or was it something else?
Hmm.
And of course, this topic was a huge philosophical and political issue, which, when he was writing this, because he's writing this shortly after the Civil War, and that was the primary legal issue, I guess you'd say, because the slavery, of course, was more of a boots on the ground issue, so to speak. But as far as the framework, it was a big argument over, okay, what rights do separate states have? If we're all separate sovereigns, why can't we just say, okay, we quit? And we can do whatever we want, and you have to respect us, and maybe we'll have a treaty or whatever. And so I think that, but the opposing side was the union argument, which is once you join, you can never leave. It's kind of like a Hotel California; you can check in, but you can never leave. And then he fleshes that out, of course, a lot more in detail and consistent with his other theories. These are we've already discussed in this book, but I think that's pretty much what he's talking about in this chapter. Is
Hmm.
a fair summary? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, it is just that one issue is the United States one thing or a group of, smaller things just loosely joined together? And he kind of goes through historically looking at things. And I think he makes a decent argument. And of course, his argument is that, it is one nation rather than several independent sovereigns just loosely joined together.
Yeah, and I'm gonna well, we can skip around. I always want to go ahead, and then you want to come back, but one of the arguments that he mentions, I think at the very end, he's talking about the Articles of Confederation, the actual Confederacy, the Confederated States before the Constitution that we now live under, or we purport to live under, depending on how you look at it. There was a failure, and so the question is, well, I mean, I was, my theory was, and now he's convinced me I'm wrong about something else, but my theory was, well, it didn't work, it wasn't practical, and so then the Union was formed, and so then it changed the relationship from several sovereign states into a union, which is one country. His argument is in this book, essentially, no, the Articles of Confederation failed because it wasn't a true reflection of what the situation was on the ground.
Hmm.
These were not separate states. People did not believe that they were separate. They were former colonies of one power, which is now independent, and therefore it's one group, although, subdivided practically between different, local jurisdictions, but it's one American people, and that's why it failed, as opposed to it just wouldn't work
Hmm.
practically. I don't know. It's a different argument. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I'm articulating it correctly. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on it?
no, I think you're right. I think that's really his central argument throughout is that, based on his whole description we've had up till now, that, like the formal constitution, the written constitution has to reflect what is already existing, in sort of the beliefs of the people. I think that is a good argument for why the Articles of Confederation didn't work, because they didn't reflect how the American people actually viewed themselves, how historically they actually operated. And of course, he talks about all those reasons a little bit later. But no, I think it is a great argument.
Yeah, and it gets me thinking about like I haven't really read anything recently about this. Of course, we're in this big election season, so maybe it's kind of put on the back burner until this national election goes. But like a year ago, I was reading a lot of different conservative writers, kind of like I don't like you say far right, but alluding to, well, maybe we just need a national divorce, some sort of separation, not saying a civil war, but some sort of separation, kind of like some of the southern states were saying, but pre-Civil War, well, we can just, take our marbles and go home or whatever. And I think his argument, I guess, what I've been thinking about since, reading this is, well, that doesn't really work as we're one nation. But then, in another sense, I guess it could work under his theory as long as the people have kind of separated themselves.
Hmm.
Like, is California? Do the people of California really think they're part of the union with Missouri? Maybe they don't.
Hmm.
Maybe the people of Missouri no longer. Some. I mean, a lot of people probably don't even think about it because it's so far away. But what happens if we all kind of agree?
Yeah.
Does that mean that is possible that we can actually agree to that, or is it war? You know,
Hmm.
I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we've kind of talked about that in the past, about that exact thing of, if different, places within the country just have entirely different belief systems. And I think I know we've mentioned in the past that it's a little bit different than it was, back then with the issue of like slavery, where you have like a clear dividing line of this is, a slave state, this is not a slave state. But now it's because people have such different opinions, or different worldviews, really, on life and marriage and all these big topics. And these are people who live right next door to each other, right? And so it's
Right.
like to some degree, I think it would be possible, if all of those people agreed and all of those people went to California and all the people, who agreed with Missouri, state of Missouri. But the problem is it's not clear geographic distinctions.
Yeah.
So it's like you'd have to have like a mass migration of people flocking, to either state they prefer, based on their values. And that would have to continue for, 50, 60 years before you have enough consolidation of opinion, I think, to really make that possible. Um,
Or you'd have a situation like India and Pakistan, which is a
yeah.
forced separation, and then all the chaos and death that resulted from that, which is horrible. Yeah, I don't think. I mean, practically speaking, I don't think we're anywhere close to it for the
Hmm.
reasons you talk about. And I think if it was attempted, either from one side or the other, I think it's war.
Yeah.
And I think I would, although I don't want to support war, but I think as an American citizen, California as a political entity is just as much mine as is theirs. I mean,
Hmm.
they might own specific property and have a primary right to possession and ownership of plots of land, but that state is just as much mine as Missouri is,
Hmm.
and vice versa.
Hmm.
And so I should be able to travel over there and visit it, and it's like I can go to Florida or New York or wherever. And who are they to say no? We're a separate country. No,
Hmm.
you're not. You want to be a separate country? Get the hell out. And vice versa. If we
Yeah.
want to say their laws don't apply to us, I mean, it really is a war, and I think that's
Yeah.
fundamentally the reason why the Civil War happened is because they're like, oh no, we just want to do what we want. No, go ahead and do what you want somewhere else,
Hmm.
but those southern states are part of this union, and you can't just take it.
Yeah.
In a way, I view it as kind of a form of theft
Hmm.
from the rest of the country.
Yeah. Interesting.
Why should I have to cross a border? It should be like just like it is now. I'm driving south to Florida, and the only difference between Georgia and Florida is you'll see a sign that says "Welcome to the state of Florida." I mean, I'm
Yeah.
still in America, uh,
Hmm.
um, California. But anyway, so kind of going off on a little
Yeah.
tangent. But I think his arguments. If if anybody paid attention to the podcast or read this, he emphasizes this. That the Constitution, the written documents, and the actual state is going to reflect, if it's effective, is going to reflect the people. And his main argument in this with regard to the formation of our country was, well, we were all, separate colonies, but we're all separate colonies that were a political subdivision of Great Britain,
Hmm.
the English Empire, whatever.
Yeah.
And then once we split off, then we're not that, but they're not separate states,
Yeah.
independent of each other. It's a group separation, and then they had to decide how to form their new union, and you've
Yeah.
articulated very well. These were still common people, and politically and socially unified in some respects.
Hmm. Yeah, I do like how he starts out the chapter too, because he essentially summarizes everything he's written up till now, in just a sentence. Because he says sovereignty under
Yeah,
God inheres in the organic people, or the people as the republic, and every organic people fixed to the soil and politically independent of every other people is a sovereign people, and in the modern sense, an independent sovereign nation. So again, we get that idea of
yeah,
sovereignty being under God, tied to the land, really embodied within the people. And then he kind of, spends a couple pages almost building up the case for secession. Because he says, any sovereign power, any sovereign nation can make alliances, really with any other sovereign nation. And that doesn't mean that now there's a new nation on top of those two. They've just entered into some kind of agreement. And he
yeah.
says, if different nations want to do that, they can. And then if nations want to leave those agreements, they can, because they haven't formed a new nation themselves. Um, and then
Yeah,
he
and
kind of,
sorry,
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, he says later in that same page, independent sovereign states cannot, by convention or mutual agreement, form themselves into a single sovereign state or nation. They're still separate. That you can have a treaty with a separate nation, and I've been thinking about this after reading this, that international relationships were so different than they are now. And you had, because we don't have any treaties. We have treaties, but we ignore them. And like for Ukraine, for example, or even Taiwan, we're talking about defending them if they're attacked, or Ukraine has been attacked. We have a treaty with Ukraine, but we have no obligation to provide them with anything. And I think that the sense that we're sending arms there, and I'm sure we have boots in the ground, although not officially, fighting this war. And of course, there's a problem with that, because I don't remember anybody declaring war on anybody, which would authorize that. But that's a whole different subject. But I think that not having those agreements and those treaties dilutes the power and the force of the treaties that we do have, and it dilutes sovereignty of our country,
Mhm.
as if we're just some sort of banking institution, or we have these informal relationships, or these kind of commerce relationships with other states with um, no treaty agreed upon that's ratified by the Senate and all that stuff. But
Mhm.
anyway,
Yeah, and he kind of continues on from there, because he says, you can really only lose your sovereignty, if you kind of give it up, in a
right,
way, right? He says, if states want to enter into a compact and they want to retain their sovereignty, they don't form a single sovereign state or nation, right? You can't have 50 different sovereigns then just want to retain their sovereignty and try and form a new nation on top of them. It just doesn't work. There has to be one sovereign if you want to be one thing. Um, and then he kind of goes on and talks about, he talks about, we've already refuted, the whole social compact theory, right? So if you're kind of relying on this to say, well, they've all entered into this social compact, they were all sovereign at one point in time, and then decided to sort of pool it together and make into one independent nation. He says, well, that doesn't work on this level either. And then he kind of turns again to his main point here. He says, the question then, whether the United States are a single sovereign state or nation, or a confederacy of independent sovereign states, depends on the question whether the American people originally existed as one people or as several independent states. And he points out, Thomas Jefferson believes that before 1787, before the Convention of 1787, they existed as several independent sovereign states, but that since that convention, they exist as one political people. And that's the point you were making earlier, that you've kind of now been convinced by Brownson is wrong, because you can't just sort of fundamentally change the way that people work, just with that one convention, right? It just doesn't quite line up, especially if you agree with everything that Brownson's been saying throughout this book.
yeah. If you look at it just on paper, it makes Jefferson's argument makes a lot of sense, and that's why I was like, yeah, okay. And it's not like I really thought about it that much,
Hmm.
but But on paper, he's right. Well, we have these separate entities, and after we separated from, the England and the king, well, they're run separately, so they're separate sovereigns. But when you really get down to it, they were not independent states with separate foreign policies. There were differences in how they handled trade and how they wanted trade to be handled. Of course, the northern states with the manufacturing and the southern states having more agrarian and various uh, combinations of that within the various colonies, I guess you'd say at that point. But really, they weren't separate. They weren't independent. They didn't have an army. I mean, they had militias, but it's not like they hadn't set up any sort of structure to actually have separate independent states. And that's especially true after the Articles of Confederation, because with that they had this idea that we're all kind of together for some limited purposes, but we're separate for others, as far as management. But they really weren't a separate people. And so, like I said, he's kind of convinced me that legalistic approach, it really just doesn't fully explain why the Articles of Confederation didn't work on the first round, and why. And his argument is that it could never have worked because it didn't really reflect the what the situation was between the people.
Yeah, and I do like how he kind of gives a little bit of the intellectual basis, like for why secession then would be like an inalienable right. He says, if you do agree, if you are under this view that it is just several states in a confederacy, then secession has to be an uncontestable right, not a right held under the Constitution or derived from the convention, but a right held prior to it. And he kind of, compares that to France too. He says, France hasn't parted with her sovereignty and ceased to be an independent sovereign nation by vesting the imperial power in Napoleon III, right? It's an argument of, just because we choose a new leader doesn't mean we've given up all of our sovereignty. He says that's sort of the argument that the secessionists are making. We've agreed to have something above us, but we haven't given up our own sovereign power. We're still the people of France, even if we have Napoleon III. In the same way, I'm still a person of this particular state, even if I have a national president above me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's kind of a compelling argument that those separate states could separate themselves from the nation after the Constitution was formed. I mean, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's irrational. I guess is what I'm saying. But I don't think it's an accurate statement. And I think once you, as a people, once you join into this kind of union, you can't back out of it. It really is very much like a marriage with no divorce.
Mm-hmm.
No, because you've changed the nature of your own political subdivision to be different, and to be a different structure, and so then as a group, you're not going to be able to pull out of it. So I think he's 100% right on this.
Mm-hmm. And then he kind of goes on. He says, kind of just keeps carrying this argument to its logical outcome. He says, the Constitution wouldn't be binding on any of these states, if they choose to withdraw. You can't appeal to the federal government. It doesn't matter anymore. I don't agree to be a part of that. I can back out whenever I want. And then he kind of keeps on saying, he says, it is simply saying that a confederation is inferior to a nation and that a federal government lacks many of the advantages of a national government, under this idea. It says confederacies are always weak in the center, always lack unity, and are liable to be dissolved by the influence of local passions, prejudices, and interests. But if the United States are a confederation of states or nations, not a single nation or sovereign state, then there is no remedy. He's kind of saying, if you kind of keep thinking of the nation in this way, or if you kind of keep trying to construct the nation this way, it's going to fall apart no matter what. If you have this belief that I can just kind of back out whenever I want and I don't really have any unity to the rest of the country, then of course it's going to kind of collapse. Of course it's going to be driven by political passions and local interests because there's nothing really binding it all together, if that's the mindset you're coming from.
Right. And you're not going to have a willingness or an ability to take the good with the bad over time, is what you're really saying, because you can't pick and choose. Or if you can pick and choose, you're going to be picking and choosing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're not going to be able to say, well, then you have to do this that you don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be able to force the other states or the federal government or whatever entity you're creating to do what you want to do when they don't want to do it if you're not willing to do what they want to do when you don't want to do it. I think I said that right.
I think all those words track.
Who's
Uh,
on? Mm,
and I do
yes.
like this sentence he has, this point he makes in 101, which is kind of the point he keeps making throughout the book, but I really like it. He says, talking about were the people of the United States one people, were they not? He says, if they were not before ordaining and establishing the government, they are not now, for the adoption of the Constitution did not and could not make them one. And I think that's a really important point. Just because, you write something down on a piece of paper and say, these are the things that we all believe, does not necessarily mean that that's the things that everybody believes, right? If they truly were separate people, separate sovereigns, then just because, one day in 1787, a group of people came together and decided that they are one nation does not make it so, right? The people have to be one people before you do that, right? The written constitution has to come naturally, from the popular constitution, from the people.
Yeah. And I like again on 101, he says, bottom half. I kind of mulled this over in my mind a couple times. He says a nation de facto is a nation de jure. So if it's a nation in fact, then in law it's in existence. So a nation de facto is a nation de jure, and when we have ascertained the fact, we have ascertained the right. So that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So that basically saying, if the people believe they're a nation, if they are a nation, in fact, then it's just a matter of having the law catch up to them. I think
Mm-hmm.
is really what I'm saying, because once they're a nation in fact, then they're going to be a nation in law, one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the point he's making, and it is an interesting one because I don't think a lot of people really articulate that,
Yeah,
at least in a manner, the book length like he's doing here. But that's the point he's making is that like to really recognize if the American people were one people or not, you just have to look at them and see if they were one people. You just have to look at the historical facts, which is almost like it sounds almost overly simplistic.
right,
That if you believe it so, then it has to be so. But I think he's right, with topics like this, where it's, the nation itself, of course, it has to rest in the people.
right.
And of course, you're just going to have to look at the history of a nation and see, okay, well, did they see themselves as one people? And if they did, then they have some sort of constitution among themselves that separates them out from a different people.
Yeah, and it's very much like just a large family, like so if well, like your grandma has their family reunion on one side of the family, then they go down to Perryville, and it's a huge group of people,
Hmm.
and they're all cousins, I guess. The main group, and then of course they all have children and grandchildren, great grandchildren. Um, Now I don't know that I consider myself personally part of that family. I mean, I am. I'm an in-law,
Hmm.
because it would be through my wife, but perhaps, but I really kind of don't. I mean, in a real factual manner. I mean, I know we're related to them in some form or fashion. But if we went every year to that reunion, we went to church with them and that kind of stuff, we'd be part of that family. And I'm not going to name the the Smith family,
Yeah.
and especially if we're all in the geographic area. So it's similar to like, well, like, the county south of me is St. Genevieve County, and they've got like, there's a certain number of families that seem to be half the county. There's like half a dozen families are like half the county population, it seems, but they all would consider themselves St. Genevieve people, from
Mm-hmm.
that county, and it's all true, and it's like a feel, and it's a relationship, but if they grow up and they're like, oh, I'm not like Genevieve people, and I'm gonna move to New York City, I'm gonna be a different type of person, then they really aren't St. Genevieve people anymore.
Hmm.
And if they come back, only if they kind of, it's like those Hallmark movies, where the Hallmark Christmas movies, like the
Yeah.
standard
Yeah. Yeah.
where the young girl goes off and to make her way in the city, and then and some sort of sorrow comes to her, and so she's forced to come back home to take care of like an animal or a family member, and then meets her boyfriend from high school, and
Hmm.
realizes that she really is home now. There's a lot of truth to that, like
Yeah.
if she is home, if that person, that man or woman, really is from that place and of that place and accepts that culture, um, that they are from that community. And similar to like what he's basically saying is, okay, yeah, there's that. It's geographic, it's a relationship, it's a perception. it's a belonging, and then you just multiply that out to a nation.
Hmm.
Okay, we're all part of this, and you're not. You people across that river are not,
Hmm.
but we are. And then that's basically his definition of a nation,
Yeah.
right? And then then once you have that, then de jure you're going to have that, because you're going to, as a practical matter, the people across the river, you're going to say, well, you can't come over here unless we give you permission, because you're from south of the river,
Hmm.
and or north, or whatever the case may be. And so his argument is, like those colonies, they were like, okay, we're all part of this club, the former colonies, and then we're not really independent. And so that's his whole theory, is that you have a cultural or societal nation, and
Hmm.
then you have some superstructure on that, which is the procedures, how you interact with
Yeah.
each other, which is the Constitution, the Big C
Yeah.
Constitution.
Well, it's kind of interesting to think about it, in terms of my life now, because, I'm halfway across the country. I'm in Florida now, 16-hour drive away from home in Missouri. And I think I definitely still feel myself as much more of a Missourian than a Floridian. I've only been here for a month, but I don't really expect that to really change. I'm going to be here for a few years, but I don't expect by the time that's done that I'll be a Floridian. But at the same time, I don't feel like a foreign person, to kind of the point that we're all, one nation.
Yes.
I'm not coming from a foreign country, coming into a completely different culture. But I do think, kind of back to the family example, I would be more of a Missourian than a Floridian. I think even after the end of my degree down here.
Yeah. Now, if you marry some local Floridian gal,
Well, I
and
don't think
as
that's going to happen.
I'm saying, that would change things, because you'd be down there, and then maybe you would be,
Hmm.
or if some, marry some gal, and you raise a family in Florida, over time you're going to be a Floridian.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
And kind of, well, like as an example, I'm a Jefferson Countyan
Hmm.
now, but I was not until I married your mother,
Hmm.
and we were engaged. And I said, okay, so after we get married, we'll live in St. Charles, which is where I was from. And she just laughed. Living in Jefferson County ever since.
There you go.
She literally just kind of laughed.
Yeah.
She didn't
Well,
even respond. Like I was joking. Like that wasn't a joke, but
oh, that's great. Well, I mean,
girls did it.
I think about this kind of a lot. I think I mentioned this about DC, when I lived there for that summer. I think I think he's kind of putting his finger on, why it was such a weird place to live, because it is for so many people so temporary. I don't
Yeah.
think, I mean, there are some people who consider themselves, well, I'm a person of Washington, DC, but there's so
Yeah.
many jobs that just cycle people in and out, whether it's in politics or industries out there. Nobody really is in Washington, D.C. because, this is my hometown and I want to be here forever. Usually it's people who are there for 3, 4 years tops, maybe 6, depending on, if they're working for a senator or something like that, or if they get reelected, maybe they'll be there for a couple decades. But I feel like that's one of the reasons that made it so weird is nobody really had like a passionate like sense of, this is my people in DC.
Well, and that's a good analogy, because well, DC, you have people that live there or work there for a long period of time. The career people,
Hmm.
but none of them live in DC. Or, not none of them, but most of them live in Maryland
Yeah, or
or
Virginia.
Virginia. And so you do have a local population, which are a lot would be employed by the federal government, but many wouldn't be local DC people. But it kind of I was only there for that one visit that I had with you. But it kind of reminded me a little bit of like Lake of the Ozarks,
Hmm.
because Lake of the Ozarks is a resort community of sorts. And so you have a lot of temp workers, like seasonal workers,
Yeah.
like you go to the parasailing outfit. Those, some of them will be locals, but a lot of them will be just like people there for the summer for that job,
Hmm.
or like any other tourist destination. But then, like in Lake of the Ozarks, a lot of the people that have homes there, that's their second home. But then you have a certain population that's retired there, but they're not from there. And so I think DC is a lot like that, because they don't really consider it their home. Like you said, they work there, or especially there's a huge, like you said, there's a huge population that is kind of transient there.
Hmm.
Or it's also similar kind of like to a college town,
Yeah.
because you have this huge population that's there from basically August through May. And then in the summer, it's a whole different feel for the community,
Yeah.
because all those people come and then they go, and they're only coming for those 9 months for maybe 4 years, or some people less, some people more, but
Hmm.
and so they wouldn't consider themselves part of that community, permanently. But and that's really what he's getting at is like, okay, what is the feel of the people? Do you feel like you are a people? And you certainly don't, feel like you're a Floridian. You've been there a month.
Yeah.
You've you've got a place to live, and you got a job there, like with a university or whatever, and all that stuff. And you set up a base, which is a home,
Hmm.
but you don't have any intention presently to live there
Yeah.
permanently. Which is kind of
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
And not to keep on this, kind of tangent for too long, but that's what always bothered me, in undergrad especially, with how like the student government and the administration would like urge students to vote in local elections. That drove me crazy, right? I don't know why you would encourage, especially for Truman, because it was, in such a rural community in Northeast Missouri, where just the ideals of the college students just had nothing to do with the values of the local population. It's like, why would you encourage people who are going to be there for 4 years, usually tops, to vote and then leave, to try and change the local politics and then just go somewhere else? They don't have any vested interest in the town. Nobody who goes to Truman really often stays in Kirksville, Missouri. Usually they go out after 4 years. I don't know, it drove me crazy.
I think you answered your own question though,
Yeah.
because the university employees don't share the values of the locals.
Yeah, that's true.
I,
Well, that's why we ended up with the mayor of Kirksville also being the guy who runs Residence Life for Truman's University, and I think a lot of that was because because he has the name recognition among all the students and is able to stay in that position because they churn out the students to go vote in local elections. He's of course a very left-leaning guy, which doesn't reflect the values of the people of rural Kirksville, Missouri.
you don't think the people of Adair County are wanting a pink? He's not a pink hair weirdo, but like,
He's close.
yeah, he's a theoretical
Yeah.
rather than the actual. I don't even know the guy. I'm just saying that. But yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, but it's a form of local election interference in a very real way. Because and what I think would be interesting for anybody enterprising in Kirksville is to look up how many of those people are registered to vote in 2 counties in Missouri.
Mm,
Because they probably didn't change their registration from their home, and there's not a lot of verification, and it's not that far of a drive. You can vote anywhere in the state of Missouri and in the morning, and vote anywhere else in the state of Missouri that same day.
yeah.
You could drive across the entire state in under 12 hours. And there's a lot of that going on.
Hmm.
Uh, but like when I went to law school at that beautiful paradise, Carbondale, Illinois, I got in-state tuition after the first semester. So I changed, in order to do that, you have to establish residency. So I changed my voting. I think I might have voted once. They had a tax issue or something like that. But so I was a registered voter in Illinois, and they were supposed to notify the Missouri, and they never did. I still was getting my voter cards in
Mm.
Missouri.
Hmm.
So I'm sure, like people say, oh, there's no election fraud, and no people don't vote twice, and they don't do the baloney. There are thousands. The only question is whether or not there's enough to change the outcome,
Hmm.
because there's always in every election somebody vote that they shouldn't have voted in that election, in every single one of them, and that's just life, because there's so many moving parts to it, and we have really no controls over our voter rolls
Yeah.
on a national level. I think we do a better job here locally, um, in our county and in Missouri, because they ask for my ID, and of course they know who I am. Hell, my mother-in-law is one of the election officials, so kind of hard for somebody to claim that. I mean, I had to be entertained if somebody said, "Yeah, I'm Mark Bishop, I live at my address." My mother-in-law would be, "Call the police."
Oh,
But
that's great.
that's a kind of street level control we need to have on elections,
Hmm.
and we certainly don't. have that. And you can't have that with mail-in ballots and all this
Yeah.
stuff. That's a whole different
Yeah. Kind of back to the book, where he's talking about, if the people decide they're a nation, they become a nation, and then any former sovereign kind of just gets dissolved, it doesn't exist anymore. And he has this interesting discussion that he kind of inserts here. He says, this doctrine may seem harsh and untenable even to those sickly philanthropists who are always weeping over extinct or oppressed nationalities. But nationality in modern civilization is a fact, not a right antecedent to the fact. And he goes into this discussion, a lot of this, sort of weeping comes from the idea that a nation is by blood, that old ideal of, a tribe, and, families. And if we lose this one, political unit, then we've lost this people and their customs entirely. He says, well, that's just not the case. And he says, he brings Christianity into it. He says, now we're all sort of one people, one body politic to some degree. It doesn't really matter what family you're from. So stop crying about it, is essentially his argument there, which I thought was pretty funny and pretty accurate.
Yeah, I doubt he'd have a lot of tears shed over Native American sovereignty, but I
I
don't
mean, I,
know.
I think that's kind of what he's pointing at. 'Cause, I mean, what else? What other sickly philanthropists were at the time concerned about the sovereignty of any individual people?
Well, I mean, you had a lot of prejudice against certain nationalities, the Irish immigrants,
Oh,
the
that's
Italian
true.
immigrants. So you had a lot of that going on through this period of time too. So it could be a reference to those European, because at that time the Civil War too. A lot of the battles in the Civil War helped. I don't want to say redeem because it's not like they needed redemption, but some of the conduct of the Irish troops really helped
Hmm.
out their cause in the long term, similar to some of the black fighters and all that kind of stuff. So, but they were considered, Irishmen were considered to be somewhat less than human by the
Hmm.
British.
Yeah.
Like they were subhuman. Their I don't know if they talk about IQs, but their intelligence and their ability to work, and they're just illiterate um, people, and so there's a lot of that prejudice going on even in that. So he might be referring to vaguely to that kind of stuff
Yeah.
too. I
And
don't know.
that's what he talks about in the next paragraph a little bit. He says, at this point, we're all so mixed together. You can't ever say, we have to be a nation of this individual people. It's not going to happen. Even under the Roman Empire, we've lost, quote unquote, nationalities that we're never going to find again, these individual peoples. And then he kind of moves back to his main point. He says, in the political order, the fact under God precedes the law. And that's really what we've been talking about, this whole time, that God, in His providence, is kind of has some sort of story for history. So the facts that the people carry out are what really have precedence, not just these vague legal theories or abstract concepts and values that you're going to try and structure a government under. And he says the notion of right, independent of the fact as applied to sovereignty, is founded in error. You can't just say I have a right to this if the fact did not exist in the first place, right? Your right comes from the fact that you are a people. You can't just one day say, I have, this right, and I'm making it up now. Now recognize me because of this right that I just made up. No, the right has to come from the people originally.
Right. Yep. I think. I mean, I don't. I always hate to skip towards the end because you always want to go back, but I really liked the last paragraph where he says, 108. The Confederation was an acknowledged failure, and it was rejected by the American people precisely because it was not in harmony with the unwritten or providential constitution of the nation, and it was not in harmony with that constitution precisely because it recognized the states severally sovereign and substituted confederation for union. And I don't know that I've ever heard that really argument articulated that precisely before. Maybe I have and just ignored it or forgotten it. But that I think is such a powerful statement and a clear-headed statement of why
Mm-hmm.
the Articles of Confederation uh, did not work and could not work, as opposed to, well, practically speaking, in order to have commerce, you need to have, a more streamlined commerce department
Mm-hmm.
and foreign policy with regard to tariffs that are unified among the colonies, and you have to have a standing army and all this and that, and a centralized banking system. I mean, I guess all that stuff is true. That to have a better functioning nation, but all that was desired, I think, in the people signed off on it because they consider themselves one nation,
Yeah.
but with different regional areas, kind of like, you know, Jefferson and St. Genevieve County, for the examples I used before, we all consider ourselves Missourians.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, you know, just because we have a county line, we'd say,
Yeah.
well, you're from Jefferson County, you're from the north, or you're from there.
Yeah.
Uh, we don't consider ourselves different people.
Yeah. Yeah, I do just want to go back. You were right. I want to go back briefly and just mention a couple of the specific points he makes in regards to, why the United States, saw themselves as a specific people. And one of them I really like is because I think you kind of alluded to it earlier, but they saw themselves, as subjects of the British Crown. They saw that they had rights, not because they were all, individual abstract concepts that each people could have, but they had rights because they were under the English government. And as English citizens, they had, the ability to have these rights because it was in their political world and they were of that same people. And then when George III started to infringe on their rights, that's when they called him a tyrant. They didn't call him a tyrant because they were already individual little pockets of sovereignty, but because they had these rights that they already agreed upon because they saw themselves as one people. And then he kind of moves on from there and talks about, when they declared, that they were independent, they didn't do so, as states separated. They did it as states united. And he says, this is of itself decisive of the whole question. When they separated from Britain, what did they think of themselves as? They saw themselves as one whole separating from the larger whole that was Britain. And so therefore, if they saw themselves as that one whole, then that makes them one people. He says, that's just the key here. If they saw themselves as one people, then they were.
Yes, good summary.
Thank you. Do you have any other final thoughts on this chapter?
No.
All right. Well, I thought it was a great chapter. I thought it was very, very well written, of course, as all of his stuff is. And I thought it was very well argumented. I think I agree with him. I think he's
I was gonna ask that if you agreed or disagreed with his view of the Constitution and why the Articles of Confederation failed.
Yeah, I mean he's convinced me up to this point. And so if I've agreed with all of the other principles he sets forward, then I kind of have to say, yeah, I mean if a nation's sovereignty is decided, by the people and whether they see themselves as a people, then of course it can't just be 1787 marked this decisive point. Because I thought, much of the same things. I think that's what a lot of people are taught. Is that, well, now, we had this new really innovative theory that these guys came up with, and that said, okay, now we're one people, now we're one nation, and it just changed everybody's thinking about the whole issue, which of course is kind of ridiculous, if you accept Brownson's arguing, and I do. I think he's right.
Yes, agreed.
All right. Well, if you have nothing else, this has been season 9, episode 9 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I am Mark Bishop. It's still Mark Bishop.
I was worried you weren't going to get the still in there. You scared me for a second. You've done that every single time, I think.